In modern times, we've gotten used to the images of dystopian societies in fiction, from a world where babies are no longer being born and children of men, to the use of human-like artificial intelligence as slaves in a dying world like Blade Runner, or the very bleak future of The Matrix, where our entire reality is a managed simulation, keeping us docile, just so that our bodies can be used for energy. There is an acceptance of the dystopia they survive in, like the proverbial frog sat in slowly boiling water. And one only need to shift their perspective slightly to realize that the world we are currently living in shares many characteristics of these dystopias. Or at the very least, there exist some extremely worrying trends. Trends that might produce a future where food makes you sick, going to the doctor can bankrupt your entire family. Social interactions have been reduced into likes and upvotes, and you can barely even tell if the person responding to you is AI. We live in a society where panels of self-appointed quote-unquote experts decide what you're allowed to hear, think, and remember. We're told what's real and what isn't, and anything that doesn't fit the script is dismissed. These things are treated not as mysteries to be explored, but as distractions, a punchline of a joke.
Don't get him too close to me, please.
It seems clear that a system has been put in place to deceive us, and this does not end at the limits of what you can see in the sky. This deception reaches down into the fundamental building blocks of your body, what you eat, why you get sick, and how that disease and treatment is commodified. It's not a wildly outlandish claim to suggest that a blanket similar to the one that has hidden truths about UFOs, non-human intelligences, and physics redefining technologies has also been used to disguise the truth about health. Following this trail leads through many of the same avenues as the hidden history of UFOs, the alliance between secret government programs and big business, classified breakthroughs in science and medicine, and the code that we have been written on, our DNA, having cosmic significance. And there is a conspiracy keeping us poisoned, low energy, lonely, and tired, too sick to look up and ask what we are doing here. But is there a way out? The long road to the dystopian health system we now live in, and how it has become enforced, started at the beginning of the 20th century, when the entire landscape was transformed, almost single-handedly, and to serve big business interests. John D. Rockefeller, already the richest man on Earth thanks to Standard Oil, now ExxonMobil, had a vision to monopolize medicine in the same way that he had oil. Petrochemicals were on the rise, and synthetic pharmaceuticals that included products derived from oil were a way to patent and own treatments in medicine. It also meant stamping out competition, most notably of natural medicine and therapies that could eat into profits. In 1910, with backing from Rockefeller and fellow titan Andrew Carnegie, the Flexner Report was released. Written by Abraham Flexner, it condemned most of America's medical schools, especially those teaching anything other than drug-based, symptom-focused treatment. Over half the medical schools in the United States shut down. The rest were brought in line, and the American Medical Association became the enforcer. Well, you know who set up the FDA and the AMA, the American Medical Association and the FDA, set up by Abraham Flexner, who was working on behalf of the Rockefeller Foundation in 1908 and the Rockefellers. And so it is fascinating because if you also look at, who formed kind of the quote unquote, everybody talks about the deep state or whatever, but the investment firm that funded the CIA basically formed it. A lot of the personnel came out of it. It was called the Brown Brothers Harriman. The same people are on the cap table of that. Same people are on the cap table of the Federal Reserve in the 1913 Payne-Aldrich Act. It's the same people. This was the start of what we now call Big Pharma. And the people running this new empire made sure that only one kind of treatment was allowed to exist. Before this, 20 to 30% of doctors in the United States were osteopaths, homeopaths, people that worked with unconventional modalities to heal the human body. In certain cases, these modalities were snake oil, but in others, they worked. They just couldn't scale. But it was never about health. It was about big business, and it was about control. A system of sick care, not health care. A system designed to turn your illness into profit. I sat down with healthcare entrepreneur and founder of Ways to Well, my good friend Brigham Bueller, to talk about the corporate capture of the American healthcare system.
There's just so much corruption, collusion, and corporate capture, and it's all real. It's all real. Like, I've lived it. I've been behind the scenes in the medical establishment. I've literally played a million roles in this space. And that's the only reason I have the knowledge I have of like where the traps are and where it is set up to set people up for failure.
What began as a hostile takeover of natural and holistic medicine by a small group of ultra-wealthy industrialists became the blueprint of how health could be defined, diagnosed, and treated for the next century. As sickness became valuable and the dehumanization of medicine became a disturbing norm, the Second World War brought with it a wholesale reframing of the human body itself. Humans were turned into experiments, very valuable experiments. In the lead up to the Second World War, once Imperial Japan had invaded mainland China and Korea, these occupied territories became the field operations of some of the darkest experiments conducted on humans in the 20th century. Unit 731, a secret biological and chemical warfare research and development program under the Imperial Japanese Army, was established in Manchuria. Under the command of General Shiro Ishii, the unit carried out experiments that included vivisection on live prisoners exposed to extreme temperatures, deliberate infections of plague, cholera, and syphilis, as well as weapons testing on live human subjects. One particularly gruesome set of experiments involved locking prisoners in pressure chambers and exposing them to extreme barometric changes to observe how the human body would rupture or collapse. Every grotesque detail was carefully recorded. But perhaps the most disturbing part of Unit 731's legacy is that those responsible were never held to account. General Shiro Ishii, who oversaw the program, was noticeably absent from the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. Instead, the biological warfare data gathered by Unit 731 was marked as top secret and quietly handed over to the United States, which was now occupying Japan. In exchange for their research, Ishii and his team were granted full immunity. None of them were ever tried. The research was then used to advance American biological warfare capabilities in the Cold War. Human suffering had been turned into valuable, usable data. And that same logic was unfolding elsewhere in post-war Germany. Morality was entirely absent in this new era of technological advance, in weapons, space, and in medicine. A case in point being the fact that Bayer, now one of the largest pharmaceutical corporations on the planet, was directly involved in the crimes of the Third Reich.
You know what's fascinating is Bayer had deep ties with the Third Reich. I don't know if you know. Yeah, Bayer had deep ties with the Nazi regime, and Bayer was a German pharmaceutical manufacturer. There's even letters back and forth between Bayer and some of the generals of the Third Reich, and it's like the experiments went great as planned. Unfortunately, all 150 women that were shipped to us did not make it through phase 1 of the trials. We kindly request another 150 Jewish women.
So crazy.
They were literally testing all of their future compounds on, Nazi concentration camp folks. And then there's a dark history there if you follow Bayer, Monsanto, and like through the chain of their history. Like in you say, oh well, that was World War II. They've got to have evolved as a company. And then you go just back to the 80s where they knowingly shipped a massive amount of hemophilia medications that were infected with HIV into third world countries.
Ugh.
And they have all the records of that, where they basically inadvertently contaminated hemophilia medications with HIV at a time when HIV was a death sentence. And then they shipped that into third world countries rather than destroying the lots because they didn't want to lose the money.
That's so crazy. The dystopian reality of the modern healthcare system was built on the machinery of death in the military-industrial complex. If war criminals could be pardoned by the U.S. government in exchange for their biological warfare research, it is no wonder that the pharmaceutical industry has grown into a system of cruelty and dehumanization. And in the search for profits, they are willing to poison the environment, our food, and our bodies, while we end up paying for the privilege. If there is one company that demonstrates this above all, it is Monsanto, or what used to be Monsanto, because in 2018, the infamous agrochemical giant was acquired in a multi-billion-dollar deal by Bayer. Truly a match made in hell. The company that thrived under the Third Reich had acquired the company that was one of the main suppliers of Agent Orange, the chemical defoliant used in Operation Ranch Hand during the Vietnam War, an era of comparably dark military history.
That corruption continues. That narrative continues all the way into the chemicals that Monsanto was using. They started shipping over to Vietnam and third world countries that didn't have the regulatory guidelines and oversight, and spraying crops with all these chemicals that then started creating birth defects, and then all the way to Roundup here in the United States.
And guess who owns the Roundup now? Bayer. And Bayer will often pay out these large sums of money to get people to shut up.
Yep.
When it's so obvious, and RFK talks about this, and you talk about it as well, where you have this rise in autoimmune, cancer, all these issues in 2008 when Roundup was introduced to the broader market. And if you look at what Roundup is, it's water-soluble chemical. It's Agent Orange. It's basically Agent Orange.
Yeah.
Which, look at what happened in Cambodia and Vietnam, all the people who've had, birth defects and all sorts of issues due to that.
In the rush to mass produce millions of gallons of Agent Orange, a contaminant emerged, dioxin, a persistent organic pollutant. It resists breakdown, does not dissolve in water, and accumulates in fat tissue. It causes cancer, birth defects, and even epigenetic mutations, meaning its effects can be passed down through generations. In the mid-1980s, Monsanto was required to pay millions in compensation to veterans of war who had been exposed to the highly toxic chemical, although Vietnamese civilians were excluded from the case. But Monsanto continued to thrive. By the end of the 20th century, the company had rebranded itself as a biotech powerhouse. It pioneered genetically modified crops and patented seeds built to withstand heavy use of its flagship herbicide, Roundup. The active ingredient in Roundup is glyphosate. Glyphosate has been linked to cancer, and it has seeped into the soil, the water, and our bodies. Like dioxin, its long-term consequences may take generations to fully reveal themselves. What we have managed to scrape together about just how much the health industry or military was involved in human experimentation shows us that at the end of the day, the general public is seen as a commodity. You only need to look at MKUltra or the CIA's official brainwashing program to know how little the secretive organs of power and control cared for people's freedom and health, let alone their sanity, as members of the public were experimented on, many becoming unknowing participants in drug-fueled attempts at mind control. Few people suspected that active experiments with behavior control methods went on long after the program was supposedly shut down. In fact, as the CIA claimed it was winding things down in the 1960s, a new division quietly picked up the work with better funding, better technology, and fewer people asking questions. This group was not just experimenting on hippies in San Francisco anymore. According to John Marks, in the search for the Manchurian Candidate, that division was the Office of Research and Development, or ORD, led by Stephen Aldrich. Their focus was not just LSD and hypnosis, it was total behavioral control. They implanted electrodes in animal brains to control movement remotely. They explored psychosurgery, memory erasure, and even discussed using reptiles to deliver chemical or biological weapons in covert assassinations. Tests were conducted on inmates at Holmesburg State Prison in Philadelphia, a full decade after MKUltra had officially, supposedly, been shut down. To support this work, members of the ORD created the Scientific Engineering Institute, a CIA proprietary organization near Boston, which included a rural lab on a several hundred-acre farm. One researcher who was questioned about their work remained tight-lipped, but did concede that they had looked at zapping parts of the brains of crows to control their behavior. And if that was what they admitted to, one wonders what they preferred not to disclose. If you want a full deep dive into this sordid chapter of the CIA, including Project MKOffin and all of the insanity that went into it, head over to the American Alchemy Substack,